Welcome to Anatomy of the Extraordinary, the podcast that unveils true, remarkable stories from the edges of human experience. I'm your host, and today we dive into another extraordinary journey.
Picture a quiet, unassuming study in a sleepy suburban neighborhood. It's April 1973, Mill Valley, California.
Right, up where the fog is rolling in off the bay.
Exactly. Wrapping around the redwood trees, effectively isolating this house from the rest of the world. And inside, sitting at a massive, heavy typewriter, is a 29-year-old man.
He's slight of build, hiding behind a thick beard and heavy glasses.
Yeah, and the desk around him is just an absolute graveyard of empty coffee cups. He's exhausted. But more than that, if you look closely at his posture, he is terrified.
Well, it's the specific terror of a career who feels the ground crumbling beneath them because he had just released a bleak, dystopian, highly experimental science fiction picture.
And it had bombed spectacularly.
Right, completely. The studio executive hated it so much, they literally locked him out of the editing room, they recut it against his will, dumped it into theaters, and the public just completely ignored it.
But then his mentor, a guy named Francis Ford Coppola, calls him up. And Coppola basically tells him to stop wallowing in his own misery, to write something new.
Yeah, something that people might actually want to see. Something with clear, undeniable lines of good and evil, rather than experimental, dystopian gloom.
So this young man, George Lucas, sits in the oppressive quiet of his study. He stares at the blank page, he reaches out, and with slow, deliberate keystrokes, he types 3 words.
3 words that are going to fundamentally rewrite the history of global entertainment.
And commerce and culture. The Star Wars.
And right there, in that quiet, fog-bound room, the blueprint for the most audacious operation in Hollywood history is born.
Which brings us to the central paradox we were exploring in this deep dive. We have a massive stack of sources today. Biographies, financial ledgers, production notes.
And they all paint a picture of a shy, introverted, incredibly conflict-averse young filmmaker.
Right. So how does a guy who can barely make eye contact pull off what is, without a doubt, the greatest corporate heist in the history of the entertainment industry?
It's wild to think about.
How does he walk away with total control of a multi-billion-dollar empire, snatching it right out from under the noses of the most ruthless studio executives on the planet?
And he did it entirely without violence, without muscle, without malice.
We did it with a piece of paper.
Who?
So for this deep dive, our mission is to explore that psychological and economic masterstroke.
It really was a masterpiece of timing, leverage, and understanding the exact psychological weaknesses of the mark.
Let's set the stage and look at that mark. It's 20th Century Fox. The year is 1975, and the studio is bleeding cash.
They are desperate. I mean, he haven't had a massive defining hit in a while, the executives are sweating, and the entire studio system is teetering on the edge of collapse.
Because the 1970s was a period of immense structural flux for Hollywood, wasn't it?
Totally. The old studio system, where they owned the theaters and had actors on exclusive contracts, had completely fallen apart. They were terrified of risk.
But they desperately needed content that could cut through the cultural noise.
Right, and they were paralyzed by their own overhead costs.
Enter George Lucas. He sits down across this massive mahogany desk from the studio chief, a man named Alan Ladd Jr. Now, I have to stop here because the leverage in this room is fascinating.
It really is, because between that bleak sci-fi failure and this 1975 meeting, Lucas directed a little coming-of-age movie called American Graffiti.
Which cost basically nothing to make and pulled in over $100 million at the box office.
Right.
He is suddenly the golden boy.
His agents are practically screaming at him. They're like, George, your directing fee is now $500,000. Go in there and demand the $500,000.
But Lucas looks at Alan Ladd Jr. and he says, I don't want $500,000. I'll take a pay cut. I'll direct this space movie for $150,000.
Which, from a traditional Hollywood negotiation standpoint, makes absolutely zero sense.
Right. Why would a director coming off one of the most profitable films of the decade willingly leave $350,000 on the table?
The studio executives must have been trying to hide their smiles. They probably assumed this kid was just a terrible negotiator with a profound lack of business acumen.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because in exchange for taking that massive pay cut up front, Lucas asks for 2 concessions.
Two things that the studio executives at 20th Century Fox literally consider to be entirely worthless.
He asks for all the merchandising rights and all the sequel rights.
What's fascinating here is the camouflage. Lucas disguised his true intentions by asking for the very things the studio actively wanted to get rid of.
Because if we look at the state of movie merchandising in 1975, it was practically non-existent.
Exactly. Fox's licensing department had just been completely shut down because it was a net loss for the company.
Wait, really? They were losing money on merchandise. How is that even possible when you think about the billions made today?
Because the model just didn't exist yet. Prior to this, movie merchandise was basically a few cheap promotional t-shirts, maybe a poster, or a novelization.
It was viewed as a marketing expense, not a revenue stream.
Right. From Fox's point of view, who on earth was going to buy plastic toys based on a weird independent space movie?
And sequels, too. The sequel market in the 70s was considered B-movie territory.
Yeah, a sequel was just a cheap cash grab that was statistically guaranteed to make only a fraction of what the original made.
So the executives happily hand over the rights. They saved $350,000 on the production budget, which made their quarterly spreadsheets look great.
And all they had to give away was the right to print some t-shirts for a movie they expected to vanish from theaters in a couple of weeks. They thought they were robbing him.
But they handed over the keys to a kingdom because they lacked the imagination to see that a movie could be anything more than a 2-hour experience in a dark room.
This wasn't just a contract. It was the birth of an entirely new industrial ecosystem. The studio thought they were buying a B-movie. They were actually seeding their own obsolescence.
We are going to follow Lucas as he uses this single contract to build an unprecedented independent empire. But signing a piece of paper in a plush Los Angeles office is one thing.
Right. Having the rights to a phenomenon means absolutely nothing if the phenomenon itself dies in the desert.
Which brings us to the execution. The heist is set, but making the movie is a nightmare. It is March 1976. We are in the Tunisian desert on the edge of the Sahara.
And a century storm hits. Torrential, biblical rain hits the desert.
The irony is palpable. He escapes the Hollywood studio system only to be trapped by the planetary weather system. The sets are washing away into mud.
The robotic props are short-circuiting in the humidity. It's a disaster.
And the atmosphere on set is toxic. The crew, mostly British union workers, are miserable. The cast is openly mocking the script.
They're reading these mythical, strange lines about the Force and just laughing between takes.
They're literally taking active bets on exactly which day 20th Century Fox is going to pull the plug, cancel the financing, and send everyone home.
And Lucas is standing in the middle of this mud pit, absorbing the weight of the entire production.
He realizes that the vision in his head, this lived-in, dirty, hyper-realistic universe, is fundamentally impossible to achieve with the technology that currently exists.
This is where the story shifts from a business negotiation to sheer, stubborn engineering. He realizes that if the tools to make this film don't exist, he has to invent them from scratch.
So he takes $10,000 of his own money, his personal profits from American Graffiti, and he founds Industrial Light and Magic, ILM.
In an empty warehouse in the San Fernando Valley, far away from the studio lots.
He hires a guy named John Dykstra and a crew of rebellious young engineers. He tasks them with inventing computer-controlled motion cameras.
Hold on, we need to talk about the mechanics of this, because inventing cameras sounds simple, but it was a monumental hurdle.
How so?
Well, in 1976, if you wanted to film a miniature spaceship flying past the screen, you just moved the camera past the model. But Lucas wanted dynamic space battles with multiple ships, laser blasts, and stars all moving independently.
Right, because everything was composited on film chemically back then, not digitally.
Right. Exactly. So to do that, you had to film the model, rewind the film, and expose it again with a different element.
And if the camera movement on the second pass doesn't match the first pass flawlessly, the image shakes.
Right, down to the microscopic millimeter. If it's off, the illusion is instantly shattered. A human operator physically cannot repeat a complex camera swoop identically multiple times.
So Dykstra and this team of engineers effectively hook a massive camera dolly up to a rudimentary computer.
The computer recorded the mechanical movements of the gears. It allowed the camera to repeat the exact same swooping banking motion 100 times perfectly.
They essentially created the world's first robotic camera system just to make these space battles look real.
But the cost of inventing entirely new technology while you are actively trying to shoot a movie is astronomical.
I'm looking at the ledgers in our sources, and they are terrifying. By late 1976, ILM had burned through $1 million of the film's budget.
$1 million in 1976 was a massive chunk of the budget. Fox was panicking. The board of directors was absolutely losing their minds.
And the pressure was compounded by the output. After a year of work, burning through $1 million in that warehouse, do you know how many approved special effects shots ILM had actually delivered?
Based on the production logs, just one.
One. A single approved special effects shot out of the 350 required for the film to function.
Alan Ladd Jr. is calling Lucas, warning him that the board is preparing to pull the plug, take the tax write-off, and bury the film forever.
The physical toll of carrying that financial and creative burden is immense.
He's financing the R&D of a new industry while trying to direct a cast that doesn't respect the material, all while a studio is breathing down his neck.
It nearly kills him, literally. By early 1977, Lucas collapses. He's rushed to the hospital with severe chest pains.
He fully believes he is having a massive heart attack at age 32.
But the doctors diagnose him with dangerously high blood pressure brought on by immense unmitigated stress. They tell him he has to stop, or he's going to die.
But he's trapped in the sunk cost fallacy of his own ambition. He has staked his reputation, his personal finances, and his life on this piece of celluloid.
So how does this salvageable mess, a film with a ballooning budget, malfunctioning technology, and a hospitalized director, become a masterpiece?
It isn't saved on the soundstage. It's saved in the dark. It is saved in the editing bay.
And the savior is his wife, Marcia Lucas.
The cognitive psychology of editing is fascinating here, because George had originally hired a traditional editor who cut the film like a slow, plodding World War II documentary.
It was logical, but it was incredibly boring.
Yeah, and Marcia steps in. She looks at this unwieldy footage, and she realizes a fundamental truth about human perception.
She tells George that if they edit this based on logical narrative pacing, the audience's brain will have time to ask questions.
Right. If you pause to explain the physics of hyperspace or the logic of a space wizard rescuing a princess, the illusion dies.
She understands that you have to override the viewer's prefrontal cortex, the logical analytical part of the brain, by intensely stimulating the visual cortex.
She says we have to cut for movement. She prioritizes kinetic energy over narrative pedantry.
She makes it so fast, so visceral, that the audience is swept up in the momentum. She takes 12 kilometers of film just for the final space battle, the Death Star trench run.
12 kilometers of raw celluloid.
And over 8 grueling weeks in a dark room, she ruthlessly distills it into an adrenaline-fueled heartbeat. She saves the picture.
It is a crucial reminder that while Lucas was the architect of this heist, he was deeply dependent on a collaborative ecosystem to actually make the asset valuable.
Marcia's editorial genius, Dykstra's engineering, John Williams' emotional score. He owned the rights, but they built the value.
Let's jump to the moment of truth. May 25, 1977, release day.
The studio's faith is so low that they only book the film in 37 theaters nationwide.
The stigma of science fiction is so strong that theater owners literally don't want it.
And Lucas himself is so convinced it's going to bomb that he doesn't even attend a premiere. He is hiding out in a diner in Los Angeles.
And he's obsessively working on the mono sound mix for the film while sitting in that diner.
I read that, but wait, what is a mono sound mix and why does working on it show his pessimism?
Well, in the 1970s, the big prestigious movie palaces in major cities had stereo sound systems. But the cheap, rundown, second-run theaters in small towns still only had mono sound, a single audio channel.
Oh, I see.
By obsessively tweaking the mono mix on release day, Lucas was subconsciously preparing himself for failure. He assumed the movie would bomb in the premium theaters and quickly be relegated to the cheap, dusty second-run houses.
He was preparing for the worst-case scenario. But then his wife, Marcia, drags him out of the diner. They drive down Hollywood Boulevard.
And as they approach Mann's Chinese Theater, they see the street blocked off by police. Traffic is at an absolute standstill.
And there's a line of people, thousands of people, wrapping completely around the block, waiting to get into a sci-fi movie. It's a phenomenon.
It shatters every record, becoming the first film in history to break the $500 million barrier. It literally saves 20th Century Fox from bankruptcy.
But we have to circle back to that mahogany desk in 1975, the supposedly worthless merchandising rights. Because this is where the tectonic plates of the entertainment industry actually shift.
Let's look at the sheer audacity of the cardboard box trick.
Right. It is December 1977, Dallas, Texas. Picture a frustrated father in a crowded department store just weeks before Christmas.
His 8-year-old daughter has seen the movie 5 times. She doesn't just want a doll. She wants the specific action figures. The princess, the Wookiee, the droids.
The father finds the Star Wars display, and the shelves are stacked from top to bottom with completely emptied cardboard boxes.
Because Kenner Toys, the company that had managed to secure the license, was entirely caught off guard, creating injection-molded plastic toys requires a massive manufacturing pipeline.
Sculpting, steel molds, factory tooling in Asia, it takes nearly a year.
They couldn't make the toys fast enough for the Christmas rush, so they had to improvise.
So the father asked the clerk, "Where are the actual toys?" And the clerk explains the early bird certificate package.
For $14, you bought an empty cardboard envelope. Inside was a piece of paper, a certificate.
You mailed it in, and Kenner promised to send you 4 action figures by June of the following year.
If we look at the mechanics of this, Kenner effectively executed a mass-market futures contract. They shorted the toy market.
They convinced consumers to hand over millions of dollars in cash up front for 0 physical product.
And they used that massive influx of consumer cash to actually fund the manufacturing pipeline required to make the toys. It's financial alchemy.
And the craziest part, people bought them. Millions of them. They gleefully bought beautifully packaged air.
By the time the actual plastic figures shipped in the spring of 1978, Kenner had generated over $100 million in revenue.
And because of that quiet, seemingly foolish pay cut back in 1975, the lion's share of those tens of millions of dollars bypassed the 20th Century Fox executives entirely.
The money flowed directly into the pockets of George Lucas. It shifted the power dynamic overnight. The talent was suddenly wealthier than the studio.
I think of Carrie Fisher, who played the princess. She later joked with her trademark dry wit that she felt she owed George Lucas $1 every time she looked in the mirror.
Because her face was plastered on lunchboxes, bed sheets, and action figures. And because of standard 1970s actor contracts, she didn't see a single cent of that merchandising empire.
I want you listening to this to really internalize this moment. Think about your own career. Imagine executing a negotiation for a project you poured your soul into, but you secure the rights to the peripheral byproducts.
And then that project spawns a shadow economy, a merchandising machine that completely dwarfs the primary revenue of the original project.
It is a staggering, unprecedented shift in wealth and autonomous control. It was the perfect heist. He walked out with the treasury, and the studio executives held the door open for him.
But this is where our narrative takes a darker turn. As we move into the escalation phase, we see that absolute wealth and absolute control change a human being.
The pacing shifts here. We are leaving the frantic, muddy energy of a film set and entering the deep, insulated, almost paranoid quiet of an empire builder.
He takes these newly acquired hundreds of millions of dollars, and his first instinct isn't to integrate into the Hollywood elite. His instinct is to build a fortress.
Skywalker Ranch. He buys thousands of acres of pristine land in the secluded hills of Marin County, far north of San Francisco.
Geographically and philosophically isolated from the Hollywood studio system he profoundly despises.
He builds a 4,600 square meter Victorian-style compound. It is breathtakingly beautiful, but if you look at the architectural intent, it is fundamentally designed for isolation.
It has its own fire department, its own agriculture. It is an ecosystem entirely under his command.
He was building a localized studio system where he was the undisputed king, the sole shareholder, and the absolute authority.
The psychological motivation is clear. He wanted to construct a reality where he would never, ever have to ask a studio executive for permission or for money for the rest of his life.
Which leads directly to the massive, terrifying gamble of the sequel, The Empire Strikes Back. Remember, thanks to 1975, he owns the sequel rights outright.
Fox is desperate to distribute it. They offer him huge budgets, blank checks.
But Lucas looks at them and says, "No, I don't want a dime of your production money. I'm going to finance this film entirely by myself."
He puts up $15 million to make the movie. We need to pause on that number. $15 million was his entire net worth at the time.
He was taking the unimaginable wealth he had just secured and putting it all back on the roulette table.
In Hollywood, the oldest, most sacred rule is never use your own money. You use the studio's money to mitigate your personal risk.
But Lucas is so obsessed with total independence, so terrified of a studio having the leverage to demand a final cut of his film, that he ignores the golden rule.
And it almost destroys everything he built. It is early 1979. They are filming at Elstree Studios in London.
And the production is, predictably, a disaster. They are falling terribly behind schedule. The budget swells from the original $15 million to $25 million and finally creeping toward $28 million.
They are burning $1 million a week in production costs. And then a representative from the Bank of America walks onto the soundstage in London.
A banker walking onto a live movie set is the cinematic equivalent of the Grim Reaper.
It's worse than that. The banker tells Lucas that the collateral he put up, his merchandise revenue and his property, is no longer sufficient to cover the ballooning debt.
The bank informs him that unless he can provide massive additional collateral immediately, they are pulling the loan by Friday.
He is days away from total financial ruin. His entire empire, the rights to his universe, are about to be repossessed and auctioned off by a bank.
Can you explain the mechanics of this? Because film financing isn't just a giant credit card. Why was the bank so aggressive?
Well, because film loans are often tied to completion bonds and daily interest rates. If a film goes over schedule, the perceived risk of the film never being finished skyrockets.
And if the film isn't finished, it can't be released, and the bank gets nothing.
Right. The bank looked at the chaos in London and calculated that Lucas was going to fail.
The irony here is absolutely suffocating. He risked everything to escape the control of men in suits dictating his art.
And because he financed it himself, he ends up cornered by a literal banker in a suit threatening to shut down his production.
He manages a frantic maneuver. He structures a new massive loan through the Bank of Boston to pay off Bank of America.
But the Bank of Boston demands a guarantor. They won't take the risk on an independent filmmaker. They need a massive corporate entity to co-sign the loan, to guarantee the debt if the movie flops.
So George Lucas, the ultimate independent rebel, has to get on a plane, go crawling back to 20th Century Fox, the very system he tried to escape.
And beg them to guarantee the loan.
He survives the crisis. The movie comes out, it is a massive critical and commercial hit, and he retains his empire.
But if you read the biographies, the psychological scar of that moment in London runs incredibly deep. He realizes a terrifying truth.
That true independence is an illusion as long as you're dealing with budgets of that scale. He had to compromise his core ideals and crawl back to the studio just to save his property.
And that compromise, that creeping paranoia about control, extends far beyond the financial ledgers. The obsession with building and protecting this empire takes a devastating personal toll.
By 1983, the financial empire is secure, but the man at the center of it is broken. George and Marcia Lucas undergo a very public, very painful divorce.
The financial settlement costs him $50 million, but the money is irrelevant compared to the creative cost. He loses his most vital creative partner.
He loses the woman who sat in the editing bay and saved the pacing of the original film.
Think about your own professional life again. When you finally achieve absolute independence, when you are the boss and no one can fire you, the greatest danger is losing your grounding wire.
Marcia was the one person who could look him in the eye and say, "George, this idea is terrible."
Without that friction, the decision-making process begins to subtly mutate.
Which brings us to the fascinating ethics of toy-driven storytelling. It's 1982. They are prepping the story for the third film, Return of the Jedi.
The co-writer, Lawrence Kasdan, and the star, Harrison Ford, go to Lucas with a serious narrative plea. They argue that the story needs emotional stakes.
It's the climax of a galactic war. People need to die. They suggest that the character of Han Solo should sacrifice himself heroically in the middle of the film to give the finale true emotional weight.
It is a foundational dramatic principle. From Shakespeare to modern cinema, sacrifice elevates the narrative and creates real tension.
But Lucas flat out refuses. He completely vetoes the idea. He will not let Han Solo die.
And the reason he gives, which has been widely documented in the sources, dead heroes don't sell toys.
This is where we have to stop and ask a profound question about the nature of art and commerce. Has the creator become a victim of his own merchandise machine?
When you start making fundamental narrative decisions, who lives, who dies, how a story ends, based on the quarterly sales projections of an action figure line, have you compromised the integrity of the art?
It's a complete inversion of his original philosophy. The man who fought the studios tooth and nail to protect his artistic vision from corporate meddling is now actively altering his own artistic vision to protect his supply chain.
He has internalized the logic of the studio executives he once rebelled against. The rebel has slowly, quietly become the emperor.
And this consuming need for absolute control This desire to curate the perfect, profitable universe doesn't just dictate the new stories he's telling.
No, it begins to retroactively affect the history of the stories he has already told.
This is where the psychology gets deeply unsettling. Let's look at a seemingly contradictory moment in 1988. George Lucas travels to Washington, D.C.
He sits before a committee of the United States Congress. The issue being debated is the colorization of classic black and white films by corporate entities like Ted Turner's broadcast networks.
Lucas is impassioned. He looks at the senators and states unequivocally that altering classic films is an act of barbarism.
He argues eloquently that films are historical documents, that they reflect the technology and the society of the time they were made, flaws and all.
He states that changing them to suit modern commercial tastes is destroying our cultural heritage.
It is a beautiful, fierce, principled defense of artistic preservation and historical accuracy.
But fast forward to 1997. The 20th anniversary of the original film is approaching. Lucas looks at his own historical document.
He looks at the practical effects, the matte paintings, the slightly uneven pacing, and he decides it's simply not good enough.
Wait, for anyone listening who might not know, what exactly goes into making a matte painting and why would he want to replace it?
Well, before computers, if you wanted a massive alien city in the background, a highly skilled artist would paint that city onto a large sheet of glass.
They would leave a clear space in the middle of the glass, film the live actors through that clear space, and the painted city would become the background.
Right. It was beautiful, tactile art, but it was static. It didn't move. And by 1997, Lucas sees the static paintings and the rubber masks, and his perfectionism takes over.
He spends $5 million to completely rewrite his own history. He creates what he calls the special editions.
He strips out the beautiful matte paintings and inserts frantic computer-generated creatures that weren't there in 1977. He completely clutters the backgrounds.
But it goes beyond cosmetic changes. He fundamentally alters character arcs. He famously alters a critical scene in a cantina where the smuggler Han Solo is cornered by a bounty hunter.
In the 1977 original, Han is a ruthless, pragmatic smuggler. He shoots the bounty hunter first under the table to survive.
In the 1997 alteration, Lucas digitally manipulates the footage, so the bounty hunter fires a shot first, making Han act purely in self-defense.
He sanitizes the character to make him more traditionally heroic, perhaps more palatable to a broader, younger demographic.
But the most staggering part of this whole endeavor isn't the changes themselves, it's the mandate that follows.
He refuses to ever release the original theatrical cuts again.
He takes the original art that the world fell in love with, the version that won Academy Awards, and he tends to bury it forever. He insists that only his altered digital vision is the true version.
This raises an important question. When a creator demands such absolute retroactive control over their legacy that they are willing to obliterate the original text, are they preserving their vision or are they erasing history?
It is the ultimate manifestation of his obsession. Controlling the future of the franchise wasn't enough. He felt compelled to control the past.
And this obsession with digital perfection, with creating artificial worlds entirely inside a computer where he controls absolutely every pixel and doesn't have to deal with the mud of a Tunisian desert.
It leads directly into the prequel trilogy. It's the late 1990s. The massive breakthrough of CGI in Jurassic Park in 1993 was the catalyst.
It showed Lucas that he no longer had to rely on messy physical reality. He could build the entire universe in a server farm.
But this time around, the ecosystem has completely changed. There is no Marcia Lucas in the editing bay to cut for movement instead of logic.
There is no Francis Ford Coppola to challenge his narrative structure. There is no rogue engineer like John Dykstra fighting with him over camera movements.
He is entirely surrounded by a corporate echo chamber of his own design. He writes the scripts for all three films entirely by himself. He directs all three films.
The technological achievements are undeniable. I mean, he pioneers digital projection and digital character creation, pushing filmmaking forward by a decade.
But the soul of the films, it's just not there.
Yeah.
The dialogue is notoriously stilted. The actors look like they were standing in front of blank green screens, struggling to emote to nothing.
Because they literally are. The essential friction of reality is gone. The messy collaboration that birthed the original magic has been replaced by the sterile absolute authority of one man clicking a mouse.
And the cultural backlash is absolutely brutal. The fans who had kept the flame of this mythology alive for 20 years feel completely alienated.
The introduction of characters designed seemingly entirely for slapstick comedy and children's merchandise, like Jar Jar Binks, sparks a level of public vitriol that was unprecedented in the early days of the internet.
Lucas finds himself profoundly isolated. He is a billionaire many times over. He owns the entire physical and legal infrastructure of his imagination, but the very people he made the stories for are actively, loudly rejecting his vision.
He achieved the total independence he sought in 1975, but he built a fortress so thick, so insulated that he couldn't hear the audience anymore.
Which sets the stage for the final, inevitable realization that the empire he built is simply too heavy for one man to carry alone forever. We move now to the climax of our deep dive, the fall and the aftermath.
The pacing here slows down. It becomes a story of inevitable surrender. It is 2011. George Lucas is 67 years old.
He is sitting in a restaurant at Disney World in Orlando for a quiet breakfast meeting with Bob Iger, the CEO of the Walt Disney Company.
Lucas looks out the window at the theme park, and he tells Iger a very hard, vulnerable truth. He says, "I know that when I die, the first line of my obituary will simply say, Star Wars creator.
That is my entire legacy. There is nothing else."
It is a moment of profound, almost tragic self-awareness. He realizes that his identity is inextricably, permanently bound to this single creation, but he also knows the biological reality that he cannot live forever to protect it.
He reveals to Iger that he has spent the last few years quietly restructuring Lucasfilm. He has decentralized his own power, built up a robust middle management tier, and set the company up to function without his daily input.
He has done all of this explicitly to prepare the company to be sold.
The ultimate rebel is finally preparing to surrender to the ultimate corporate system. The formal negotiations begin in earnest in January 2012.
And it's a fascinating clash of titans. Lucas, acutely aware of the deep cultural weight of his mythology, demands $7.4 billion.
He points directly to Disney's recent acquisition of Pixar Animation and says, "My company, my universe, is worth just as much as Pixar."
But Bob Iger is a ruthless corporate pragmatist. He looks at Lucasfilm and he sees a massive legendary brand, yes, but he doesn't see a pipeline.
Right. Pixar had a well-oiled machine producing a new, highly profitable movie every single year.
Right.
Lucasfilm hadn't produced a Star Wars movie in almost a decade.
So Iger values it at $3.5 billion.
They haggle for months. They negotiate leverage. And they finally settle on a number, $4.05 billion. Half in cash, half in Disney stock.
But Lucas, even in the act of surrender, cannot entirely let go. He tries to initiate a Trojan horse strategy to maintain his influence.
He secretly appoints his longtime friend and legendary producer Kathleen Kennedy as the president of Lucasfilm right before the sale goes through.
His hope, his desperate gamble, is that Kennedy will act as a guardian of his personal legacy, a bulwark against the homogenizing forces of the Disney corporate machine.
And as part of the deal, he hands over his personal, highly detailed story outlines for the next 3 films. Episodes 7, 8, and 9.
He hands them over with the implicit, deeply held belief that Disney will film his stories, that his vision will continue to unfold, just funded by a corporate conglomerate's money.
But this is where the naivete of the independent filmmaker clashes with corporate reality. Disney didn't pay $4 billion to act as George Lucas's production company.
They paid $4 billion for the unfettered rights to the intellectual property.
The betrayal is swift, absolute, and corporate. Bob Iger and the newly hired director, J.J. Abrams, look at Lucas's outlines. They analyze the risk.
They decide his ideas are too experimental, too deeply weird, too risky for a $4 billion investment. They want a safe return. They want nostalgia.
They want the original characters doing the things people remember. They literally throw George Lucas's outlines in the trash.
And then comes the moment that breaks him. Lucas sits in a private screening room on the Disney lot. He watches the rough cut of The Force Awakens.
And as the lights come up in the screening room, the crushing weight of what he has done settles on him. He realizes they haven't pushed the story forward.
They have just built a highly polished, risk-averse nostalgia machine that copies the beats of his 1977 film.
They manufactured a product precisely designed to appease the maximum number of consumers, prioritizing familiar dopamine hits over a narrative born from a singular, challenging creative vision.
And Lucas is utterly devastated. In an incredibly rare moment of unguarded, raw public emotion, he gives an interview to a journalist shortly after.
In that interview, he states that he feels like he sold his children to, quote, white slavers.
It is a shocking, solemn, deeply uncomfortable statement.
It is the stark realization of the sheer brutality of corporate acquisition. He realizes he didn't just sell a company.
He sold the very soul of his life's work, and he realizes he absolutely hates what the buyer is doing with it.
And what the buyer does with it is a masterclass in relentless corporate industrialization. Disney immediately begins the Marvelification of the franchise.
They need to recoup that $4 billion, and they need to satisfy their shareholders fast.
They immediately shut down LucasArts, the beloved video game division, firing the entire development team to license the rights to outside publishers.
And in a move that crushes the hardcore fan base, they issue a sweeping corporate decree that completely erases 30 years of the expanded universe.
Hundreds of books, comic books, and interwoven narratives that fans had passionately loved and invested in for decades are suddenly declared non-canon by a corporate press release.
Erased from official history simply to provide a clean, unencumbered slate for Disney's new content pipeline.
It's the ultimate assertion of ownership, a corporation rewriting the reality of a fictional universe to suit its quarterly production schedule.
But the mandate to produce content at all costs leads to absolute panic behind the scenes. The production of the new sequel trilogy is chaotic.
Directors are hired with fanfare and quietly fired months later. Scripts are written, shredded, and rewritten on the fly during active filming.
And the strategy of releasing a new movie every single year backfires spectacularly. In 2018, the spin-off film Solo hits theaters.
The production was a well-documented nightmare. Directors were replaced mid-shoot, and the budget ballooned to an astonishing $300 million.
And for the first time in the 40-year history of the franchise, a Star Wars movie flops. It actively loses money at the box office.
The invincible mythical brand suddenly looks incredibly fragile. The high-volume Marvel formula fundamentally isn't working for a mythology that was originally built on scarcity, anticipation, and event status.
Which brings us to the climax of this corporate industrialization phase. It is December 2020. The global pandemic is raging. Theaters are closed.
Bob Chapek, the newly minted CEO of Disney, holds a massive 4-hour Investor Day presentation streamed online. And he announces the future.
The future isn't the movie theater. The future is the streaming platform, Disney Plus thing.
He announces that this grand mythology is going to be transformed into a content pipeline. They announce 10 new series in rapid succession.
The explicit goal is to feed the platform algorithm, to drive towards 260 million monthly subscribers to appease Wall Street.
This encapsulates the tragedy of the modern media landscape. A story that began as a sacred cinematic pilgrimage, a mythical event that people literally camped on sidewalks for weeks to experience in the dark with strangers,
has been reduced to a digital tile on an app on your phone.
That's exactly the friction, sitting right there next to a reality cooking show and a nature documentary.
The corporate mandate is no longer to tell a singular great story. The mandate is to churn out weekly engagement metrics to reduce subscriber churn. The magic has been fundamentally mathematically optimized.
It feels like the ultimate crushing defeat of George Lucas's original vision. The rebellious, independent, eccentric spirit completely absorbed and sanitized by the relentless, grinding gears of a media monopoly.
But this is where the story takes one final, incredibly fascinating turn. As we move into the conclusion, the legacy of this deep dive, let's reflect on what happens when a story is released into the wild.
Because despite the overwhelming industrialization of the brand, a spark of the original rebellion somehow survives.
Life finds a way, even inside a corporate machine.
Under the leadership of Kathleen Kennedy, the executive Lucas left behind, and a fiercely independent writer named Tony Gilroy, a television series called Andor is released onto that very streaming platform.
And it is a shock to the system. It completely ignores the corporate mandate for comforting nostalgia. There are no magical Jedi, there are no glowing lightsabers, there are no cute, easily merchandisable aliens.
It is a grim, intense, hyper-realistic, and deeply psychological look at the mechanics of fascism. It explores the agonizing, granular pain and the moral compromises required to build a rebellion from the mud up.
It strips away the comforting space fantasy and exposes the raw political core that was always hiding inside Lucas's original 1977 vision, but it delivers it with a maturity and a narrative density the franchise had never seen before.
And the real-world sociological impact of that specific story is startling. Let's look at a factual event documented in our sources. It is January 2026, Minneapolis, Minnesota.
And to be clear, we are maintaining total political neutrality here, taking no sides, merely reporting a documented sociological event provided in the source material to illustrate the cultural penetration of the text.
Right. There are massive, volatile protests in the streets. People are marching against ICE deportations. The political climate is incredibly tense.
A moment of profound civic friction.
Amidst the crowd, photojournalists spot protesters holding up homemade cardboard signs. And the signs aren't quoting historical philosophers or politicians or real-world activists.
The signs are quoting lines of dialogue directly from the Disney Plus series Andor. One prominent sign reads, "The death of truth is the ultimate victory of evil."
If we pull back and connect this to the bigger picture, the implication is astounding. The story has completely escaped its creator. George Lucas doesn't control the meaning of it anymore.
But even more surprisingly, it has escaped the corporation that owns the copyright. Disney manufactured that television show specifically to drive monthly subscription revenue and boost their stock price.
But the people watching it took the message, extracted it from the digital platform, and repurposed it as a literal tool for real-world civic resistance.
Even deep inside a highly sanitized, algorithmically driven corporate machine, the rebellious spirit that a terrified, exhausted young George Lucas fought so desperately for in a muddy, freezing Tunisian desert in 1976.
That spirit found a way to survive the corporatization. The story no longer belongs to the man who wrote it on a typewriter.
It no longer belongs to the conglomerate that bought it for $4 billion. The myth now belongs entirely to the people who use it.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought. I want to address you directly. Think about the technological landscape we are entering at this exact moment.
Disney recently invested billions of dollars into Epic Games and the Unreal Engine, the technology that allows them to render hyper-realistic digital worlds in real time, completely removing the need for physical sets, weather, or location shooting.
At the same time, generative AI is knocking down the doors of Hollywood studios, promising executives that it can write scripts, generate imagery, and optimize narratives on demand without the need for difficult, expensive human artists.
We have spent this entire deep dive tracing how a defining cultural myth was born precisely from friction. It was born from the obsessive, flawed, deeply human mind of a creator fighting against a system, pouring his own neuroses, his health crises, his divorce, and his desperation into the fabric of the story.
The art was shaped by the struggle. So if the technology is being designed specifically to eliminate that struggle, we have to ask ourselves what happens to our modern myths when they are no longer born from the friction of a human mind fighting a system?
What happens when our myths are generated by the system itself? When the algorithms calculate the perfect narrative beats to keep us passively engaged, what kind of stories will we be told?
Can a machine, programmed by a corporation to maximize profit, ever truly dream of a rebellion? Or will it only ever dream of, and teach us, compliance?
It is something deeply important to think about the next time you tap that app, or buy that ticket, or purchase that piece of merchandise.
Think about the stories you consume, how they are built, the friction or lack thereof in their creation, and who is really pulling the strings behind the curtain. Keep questioning the narrative.
Thank you for joining us on this adventure. Until next time, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it and keep seeking the extraordinary.